I've loved liminal spaces for as long as I can remember. However, when I was a child back in the early 2000s, this now famous phenomenon didn't have a name or a dedicated community online. Instead, being confronted with one of these spaces created a familiar and calm, yet uneasy feeling which I always found difficult to express or describe to those around me. A long corridor in a doctor's surgery. The shuttered frontage of an empty unit in a forgotten corner of the local shopping centre. The echoey staircase in a multi-storey car park, just as a familiar orange glow of sodium streetlights came on. The internet has taken the idea of liminal media and run with it, evolving this simple human response to being confronted with an uncanny space into juggernauts of online culture such as the backrooms. While I appreciate and admire these mainstream interpretations of liminality, if you can call a niche internet subculture mainstream, I'd like to take a look today at liminality through the lens of childhood. A liminal space is most often a transitional space, a place not really designed to be studied or even considered by those passing through it. Most of the time, they're almost like little pieces of background in life's jigsaw, which make up the world around you. As a child, noticing these little, insignificant places always felt like I was seeing a secret world that no one else really bothered to take notice of. Given the rise of the liminal aesthetic online and the associated nostalgia felt by late millennials and early Gen Z who are now adults, I'm happy to know that I wasn't alone in these observations. Let's look at some examples. One of my favourite types of liminal space is a deserted swimming pool. Especially at night. There's something so strangely disquieting about somewhere usually so full of activity left empty. Others must feel this way also, given the popularity of the pool room subgenre of liminal space. As a child, my local swimming pool always seemed like this huge expanse filled with corridors, tiled walls, and an impending sense of dread if you dared stray near the deep end of the big pool. Built in the 70s or 80s, the utilitarian design language of the building was absolutely fascinating to me and just added to the uncanniness of the place. The smell of chlorine, the slightly worn out carpets, the vending machines standing impossibly tall in the foyer. These are all things that stick out in my memory and add to the sense of dread when I picture them at night, unused and empty. I imagine that being taken swimming is a pretty universal experience, and the imposing nature of swimming pools, I'm sure, has left an impression on many children. If you were to become separate from a parent in those vast changing rooms, even for a few seconds, you would be forced to take in the details of the space, a faceless and clinical environment with confusing identical lockers, cubicles and showers. The shadowy confinement behind those old nylon cubicle curtains as you scanned around for the safety of a familiar face, casting doubt on your senses. The focus of a trip to the swimming pool, especially as a child, was about the people you were with. Friends, family, classmates from school, and the activities you'd do there. Once you shifted your focus to your actual surroundings of the building itself, something felt off, wrong, isolating. What lurked in the store cupboards or behind the air vents? I remember being taken to a holiday village and visiting their enormous swimming pool with a vast glass dome above. Seeing the pool near closing time, when most families were heading back to their cabins after sunset, the jacuzzis aimlessly frothing water, the wave machine carrying almost nobody along, the empty lazy river gushing away and heading outside into the evening air, really left an impression on me, which I could never put my finger on until I discovered the phenomenon of liminal spaces. Another big factor in these kinds of unsettling places is the outdoors being brought indoors. The tropical theming, complete with fake plants, fake rocks and shipwrecks, I always found overall eerie and off-putting. This sort of decor dates back at least as far as places like popular British holiday camps, Butlins and Pontins in the 1950s and 60s, many of which now are abandoned and empty. I'm sure there are lots of places like this in the US also. These videos showcase Butlin's minehead, the water still running in the abandoned Sunsplash pool. People who experienced these places as kids now return to document the years of decay. These videos really give me that liminal feeling. Water and liminality go hand in hand for me. The uncertain depths staring unforgivingly back, hiding the floor from view. Another great example of the kind of liminality we encounter during childhood are the images used on toy packaging and the background sets from TV advertisements for toys. Solar Sands mentioned this in his excellent video on liminality, but toy packaging often gives off a very strange vibe. The idea of this miniature world, which only exists to contextualize the products being displayed, is unsettling. Imagining what might lie outside of the borders of the image is like glimpsing a forbidden snapshot into a different reality. I remember part of the appeal as a child of toys like Lego and Playmobil was being part of this idealised world, which only really existed on the box and in your imagination. The same can be said for advertisements. The strange, perfectly manicured reality that's presented defies everything we know about real life and how the world is. And yet, this idealised view of playtime must work effectively to sell the products. Realistic enough to convince the mind of a child, yet unable to really stand up to much scrutiny without falling into the uncanny valley. Everything seems to exist in this void where the sun is always shining, or the playroom has been set up in some fantastic way, something inaccessible to the children watching at home. And yet that experience is fundamentally part of the product being sold. When I was a child, I had this Playmobil airport set, and one of my favourite things to do was imagine being there at night, roaming the empty corridors of this miniature world, even going so far as to turn the lights off and place torches around the model so that I could just for a second get a glimpse of what it would be like to experience it for myself. Maybe I was just an odd child, but that sort of imaginative play conjured up the same feeling as images like the famous Heathrow Airport Hotel does now. A lot of what my generation associates with liminality, such as abandoned malls and the tail end of the dominance of physical retail, I believe is to do with remembering the 2008 financial crisis and its after effects. Here in the UK, I remember visiting shops such as Woolworths and its larger partner Big W, seeing all the stock being sold off as the company was liquidated. This made you look at the fabric of the retail space and consider it in ways which you hadn't before, exposing spaces which wouldn't even normally be looked at twice. This absence of the familiar rows of products was one of the first times I remember thinking about the logistics of a business like that and how quickly something could go away, leaving nothing but the unsettling shell of what was once there. A lot of these shops stood empty for many years afterwards and became part of the background that nobody really took much notice of. Spaces that people at one time passed through in order to buy their goods and now simply pass by in order to go somewhere less desolate. These shops became liminal spaces once the crowds had left, and they were frankly everywhere at the time. A shopping centre is one of the best places to find a quiet liminal corner. especially when the theming utilises the idea of bringing the outdoors inside. Many malls built from the 70s onwards incorporated this aesthetic, aiming to capture the ambience of the outdoors while offering the convenience of indoor shopping, some even going so far as to have an entire theme park located within their walls. This style of architecture has always stood out to me as particularly bizarre and liminal, becoming even more so with the passage of time and the decay of physical retail. Allowing yourself to break the illusion of being outdoors and really considering your surroundings, realising that you're within an elaborate set, really hammers home the strangeness of wanting to bring what's outside in. And yet, in a way, I wish more places like this were still around and I could again experience what I did all those years ago, when that sort of architecture was more popular. At least they were doing something more interesting than modern corporate architecture. More generally, my generation remembers the end of the golden age of the mall, when the fountains were still turned on, the food courts were busy, and they were the only real place to go for your Christmas or birthday shopping. Seeing those places now empty creates a very strong liminal atmosphere, which contrasts starkly with what lives on in our memories. The final childhood liminal spaces I'd like to discuss today are museums. A visit to the museum was and is a great place to experience that liminal sensation. The long corridors, the huge exhibition spaces, the glossy reflective floors and spotlighting all contribute to the uncanniness of a space that's trying to draw your attention to the information on display and away from the fabric of the building around you. The sheer scale of somewhere like that compared to a child is overwhelming. A glance away from the displays towards a half-lit back room behind a security door breaks the immersion, but opens a new appreciation for the space you're in. Perhaps when everyone else had moved on to the next exhibit, you could sneak a peek behind the scenes or consider what the space would be like at night. Artificial representations of real spaces, a projection of outer space on a white wall. The booming voices of video narrators coming from different rooms and overlapping. Of course, we have to talk about the fascinating phenomenon of the outdoors indoors again. There are lots of museums which will have an old-fashioned street scene inside, with recreations of Victorian shops, unconvincing mannequins, artificial sound effects and lighting, which really have a strange atmosphere, especially when perceived by a child. Other museums cater specifically to child-sized recreations of the real world, which again are bizarre, and the phenomenon of kids' cities falls within this umbrella also. Strange, idealised versions of the real world, almost convincing, but again, uncanny in their miniature perfection. I hope this small look into the world of liminality through the lens of childhood has stirred something in you as it has in me. This video is not meant to be comprehensive, but if it made you consider something you've not before, I'm happy. My experience may be totally different to yours, and I'd love to hear your thoughts on the theme of liminality in childhood. I've most certainly enjoyed exploring this topic while making this video.